do organic outreach, education, and try to spur some increased research in organic areas. Thank you for joining us. It is a beautiful day. I expected some pretty low attendance, but that's why we're recording this. So hopefully some more people will be joining us. So welcome if you're joining us from recording as well. So a couple quick reminders. Please keep your microphone on mute while the speaker's talking, of course. We will have time for questions and discussions. If you have a question while she's presenting, please go ahead and you can put that in the chat box, or you can save it and we can open up mics later. Or Christine, do you want to take questions while you're presenting, or would you rather kind of wait?
Oh, we can take questions as I'm presenting.
If it makes sense, I'll bring them up.
It's hard for me to monitor the chat, so if you
I can take care of that.
Anything, let me know. Thanks.
Yep, definitely. Okay. And so I'll keep an eye on the chat. I'll keep an eye on mics too. If somebody starts making some noise, if you start making noise, I might mute you. So just if you're on telephone and you need to unmute again, the control for that is *6. And that's all the housekeeping I have. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker, and that is Christine Sprunger. She has been with Ohio State since 2018, and she is a soil scientist who has done some very fascinating work in the past. She focuses on rhizosphere science, and I'm going to turn it over to her.
Great, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Today I'm going to be talking to you all about soil health, especially within organic corn production, and really try to address the question, which management practices most influence soil health in organic corn production? So I'm sure that many of you have noticed that the term soil health has really gained a lot of attention and prominence in recent years. I was just reflecting back on the fact that I started grad school back in 2010, and we hardly ever talked about soil health. This, I would say, really in the past 5 years has picked up a lot of steam. And really why it's become such an important term is that it has importance at local and regional scales, which means that, at the local level, soil health can really give a lot of information to farmers at the field scale. And then regionally, soil health can really give us important indicators about ecosystem services, how we're retaining nutrients on the landscape. Another reason why we've seen prominence in recent years is farmers just really want more information from current soil testing. So we often hear farmers say, I've been looking at my soil organic matter value and it just doesn't change from year to year or every 3 years that I sample. It's hard to move that needle. Are there other tests that can help me understand what's happening on my field? We've also seen a lot of enthusiasm for different soil health indicators that might be more sensitive to recent changes in management. Again, it's frustrating if you've just recently incorporated cover crops and you're not seeing any benefit in terms of increases in your soil organic matter. And again, just with increasing pressures to improve soil health and linking that to important ecosystem services like protecting our water, fresh bodies of water, all of that I think is really linked to this enthusiasm for soil health. And then the final thing I'll just mention, which is really, I think, most of interest to farmers, is just understanding the link between improvements in soil health and what that means for increases in soil organic matter. And so when we think about soil health and how we can actually quantify it, it's important to really think about what soil organic matter is and what the important pools are that kind of make up soil organic matter. So we know that microbial activity is a really important part of soil organic matter, and we measure this using respiration. So a lot of you might be familiar with like the Solvita test, which is really quantifying CO2 that's coming off of a re-wetted soil sample. That's telling us how active the microbial community is, and also gives us a good indicator of how much organic matter you have in your field. Then we also have the active carbon pool. This is kind of your carbon bank, the pool of carbon that the microbes are actually getting the energy from to produce that CO2. And we also know that it's a really good early indicator of how much soil organic matter you have, and whether or not you might be accumulating carbon over time. And we also see, again, that both the respiration and active carbon are really sensitive to recent changes in management, and also can serve as really good predictors of agronomic performance, so your crop yields. And then soil protein is really trying to get at that, or the nitrogen pool as that's part of soil organic matter. So thinking of that organic nitrogen pool, what's available to microbes so that they can make nitrogen available for plant uptake. And so, sure, we have these soil health indicators, but how do we actually improve them and increase them over time? So we know that, the practices that can best improve soil health are going to be the same practices that best increase soil organic matter over time. And you've all heard this, the principles of increasing soil organic matter tend to be increasing your organic matter inputs and reducing your soil disturbance. And it also helps if you have year-round ground cover to really protect your soils from wind erosion and intensive rain events. So some of those practices could be having no-till, leaving residue on your field, incorporating a cover crop, increasing that crop diversity, which is going to be important for increasing the carbon inputs into your field and really feeding the microbial community. And then also incorporating perennials. We know that rather than having a cash crop every year, maybe having a perennial with those deep roots is also really important for building organic matter over time. And this is just a graphic showing why scientists especially are so interested in having perennials in farmer rotations. And it's, again, these deep roots that exist throughout the growing season. This is an example of a perennial grain crop that you can see just throughout the year has 3 to 4 times greater root production relative to the annual wheat. And again, especially in the middle of the growing season and then towards harvest, you just have that constant input of carbon from fine root production. We also know that you can play around with different nutrient inputs. So thinking of compost additions and manure, those are also going to be really important ways that you can boost soil organic matter and hopefully increase some of those soil health indicators. But we know that the reality is, even though we know that there are all these different management practices, especially within organic farming systems that do an excellent job of increasing soil organic matter and soil health, the reality is you do have to introduce disturbance into your field, especially for weed control. And that, of course, is the introduction of tillage in your system. And we know that there's often this trade-off in terms of increasing soil health, but then introducing tillage. What does that actually do to your soil health indicators? And so we'll talk about kind of those trade-offs throughout this this talk. And so just giving you some questions that I often hear from farmers regarding soil health testing. The number one question I get is, how do I improve soil health on my farm? And of course, that's closely linked to what management practices are most effective at improving soil health. What kind of crops should I grow in my rotation to improve soil health? We also get the question of what is a good value for a given soil health indicator? Think back to that respiration value that's closely related to the Solvita test. A lot of times people don't know, what if I get the soil health test report, what's a good value? I don't know what number this is. how does it relate to others? How does it relate to my neighbor's field? We realize that, these are important gaps that are missing in the scientific literature. And in order for soil health testing to be valuable, we need to be able to address some of these farmer questions. And so we took some of these farmer questions and developed them really into research questions that we could test through different experiments. So the first is really thinking about how soil type influences soil health indicator values and distributions across a wide region. So, if you have a sandier soil, what's a good respiration value for a sandier soil? These are the types of questions we wanted to help address and be able to provide feedback to farmers. We also wanted to, again, address what management practices most influence soil health and corn production across Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, understanding that it's important to build these regional data sets, again, to be able to pinpoint regionally how these different management practices are really impacting soil health on farmer fields. So what we wanted to do was build a regional soil health database. We wanted to develop these distributions. What I mean by that is really just thinking, across all these different states and soil types, how does soil health vary across the region? Because, we need this information to be able to say, this soil health indicator is above average relative to other farms with a similar soil type. And we also wanted to assess the extent that various management practices influence soil health. And additionally, we wanted to make, this data set regionally relevant. And we're not the first kind of group of scientists to try and do this. There's a group from Cornell University that actually did this and published a study in 2017. The only really unfortunate thing is they left out data from Ohio. And so we felt like there was a major gap in understanding soil health in Ohio. And that's kind of what we set out to do. So the approach that we took was we teamed up with social scientists who are really skilled at distributing wide surveys across multiple states. And they sent a survey to every organic certified corn grower in Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, and Pennsylvania. And the soil scientists on the team, we just decided to offer a free soil health test for anyone who completed a survey. And so we sent out that postcard and we received several postcards back. Clearly people wanting that free soil health test and wanting information about soil health on their fields. So when we got that postcard back, we sent out instructions to farmers to actually sample their own fields and then send us back their soil sample in the mail. And then once we received that soil sample, we analyzed that soil for a whole range of soil health indicators. And then we provided farmers with a comprehensive soil test and so a soil health test report, and so that they could see, how their fields varied in terms of soil health. It was also important for us to document the different types of management that different farmers were using. And so we also had farmers fill out a smaller management survey. This is just an example of a question asking about the different crops that farmers grew within the rotation. You can see here that this is a farmer that had hay 3 years and then corn 1 year. But this is a really important question because it definitely ties into a lot of the results. And we use this to build kind of a crop diversity index, really just understanding the number of crops that farmers have in their rotations. We also asked about tillage. It was important for us to quantify the number of tillage passes that farmers were reporting. So here, over the course of 4 years, the farmer had 4 tillage passes. And then this is just a demonstration of the 4 states and the counties that we received soil samples from. So we received soils from 73 counties across the 4 states, and we got a total of 195 soil samples. So let's get into some of the results. So in terms of a summary of the management practices, you can see that a majority of the farms present actually had under 100 hectares of land. So that's about 200 acres or less. The majority of farmers were growing organic corn over the 4-year crop rotation. Surprisingly, we found that the presence of a perennial crop, such as having hay or alfalfa in your field, it was 63% of farmers reported having 2 years or more of a perennial crop, and typically it was alfalfa. And we also asked about subscription to soil balancing. So this is really just farmers actively managing calcium and magnesium ratios by applying high calcium or gypsum. And we see that over half responded that yes, they were actively managing for soil balancing. And then just in terms of the presence or absence of different management practices, you can see that 87% of the farmers were adding manure. Only 47% of farmers reported incorporating cover crops. Perennials in the rotation again was 76% of the farmers that participated in the study, and then over 90% of farmers were incorporating some type of tillage. All right, so let's get into some of the results. What is a good soil health value? And again, to answer this, we came up with distributions of the soil health indicators. And I know this is a lot to look at, but if you turn your attention to the organic matter panel, we're all kind of familiar with what a good organic matter value is, and how we kind of split this up was thinking about if you had a coarse soil, a medium, like a silt loam soil, and then a fine soil is your clay loam. So we see that like for a medium soil texture, a silt loam, medium value or average value was 2.4%. So anything above that would be, of course, above average. So we can do the same thing for, let's say, mineralizable carbon, which is that Solvita respiration test. And we actually see that for a silt loam soil, that medium soil texture, a medium value would have been around 55. And so when we give farmers a soil health test report back, we can finally say, well, you had a 60 for respiration, and that means you're above average relative to farms that had a silt loam soil. And so it's kind of like jargony, but it was important for us to be able to really be able to report this type of information to farmers and give them a general sense of where their values are in terms of others across this entire region. And so let's think a little bit more about the different types of management. Because we were asking so many questions about management, it was important for us to understand, how these different managements related to one another. So what's the relationship between different types of management practices? Here we see 2 kind of scatter plot graphs that are showing the relationship between tillage and crop diversity, so total number of crops in the rotation, and then tillage frequency against the length of time that the perennial crop was actually present in the rotation. And we see some opposite trends, right? So we see that tillage frequency increases when you have an increased number of crops in your rotation. So what does this mean? This likely means that farmers are just having to till more when they have more diverse crop rotations, when they have more crops in their rotation. And then we see exactly what you would expect to see. The longer that alfalfa or hay was in their rotation, the less tillage you had in the system. And these are really important in terms of some of the results that I'll be showing next. So how do different management practices influence soil health in corn production? So this first graph, again, I know it's a lot to kind of take in, but this is just asking how crop rotational diversity influences some of these different soil health indicators. And what we generally see is surprisingly a decreasing trend where we have lower soil health in areas where there's greater crop diversity. And again, these are relationships with a lot of noise in the data, but it's important to kind of point out that generally we saw decreases in soil health values when there was an increase in crop diversity. And we'll talk maybe, why that is with this next slide. Again, remember we saw that kind of significant relationship between crop diversity and tillage frequency. And again, we see when we look at the impact that tillage might have on soil health, we're also seeing kind of this decreasing trend, especially within mineralizable carbon. So this is, again, your respiration, the microbial activity. And we see, a decrease in microbial activity with an increase in tillage frequency. So all this means is that the greater amount of disturbance that you're introducing into the system, you're decreasing your soil health. But let's talk about something a little bit more positive. We actually saw that when perennials were incorporated into crop rotations, we actually see an increase in soil respiration over time. So the longer that you have a perennial in your rotation, the longer the more you're able to increase soil health. So that, I think, is a really important component of how we actually build soil health, how we build organic matter is, again, if you are able to incorporate perennials in your rotation, then generally we see this nice increase in your soil respiration, which again is an important indicator of soil health and overall soil organic matter. So just in summary, organic farmers in the Great Lakes region utilized a wide range of management practices to maintain crop rotational diversity, but we did see this really complex kind of interaction between crop rotational diversity and an increase in tillage frequency. And generally, we saw that when an increase in crop rotational diversity was linked with an increase in tillage, and then we saw lower levels of soil health. But when we saw increased perenniality or increase of the presence of perennials in the rotation, we saw a decrease in tillage and an overall increase in soil health. So I know this is kind of counterintuitive. I don't want people to kind of take away that crop diversity isn't good, but I think we just need to be mindful, especially in the organic systems where tillage is such an integral role in management. We need to be mindful of the number of tillage passes that we actually use in a given 4-year rotation, because that definitely has a major impact on the capacity for your fields to improve soil health. So with that, I'll just acknowledge and give a special thank you to the farmers who participated in this study, and also just several colleagues and collaborators that helped with running the soil tests and helped with data analysis and helping with this paper that we're working on. So, and then funding sources, Foundation for Food and Agriculture and the USDA OREI. And I'd be happy to take questions.
Thanks, Christine. We've got one question in the chat already that you can start chewing on. Eli wants to know if you analyzed the difference between the different types and depths of tillage and how that affected soil health measures.
That's a great question. So for this particular analysis, we only looked at the frequency of the tillage, so the number of passes, but we're working on another study, early phases, where we're taking in account the different types of tillage, and again, getting at like the different depths. There are different kind of calculations that we can do to come up with kind of intensity, tillage intensity values. And I think that will also be a really important piece in terms of pulling out this tillage story.
Christine, did you do any kind of comparison, or did you include organic practices as kind of a treatment in the study? And, you know, did you focus on like years in organic production or anything like that versus conventional?
So these were all organic studies, or all organic farms. But I haven't yet pulled out length of time in organics. So that would also be another important indicator to look at. So that's a good suggestion.
So we got a comment here from Paul. One of his takeaways is that in organic farming, when using more crops in rotation, we need to focus on how to do tillage reduction. And I think it's a question, but I think it's just also a comment. We know there's been some interesting research in Wisconsin and by Rodale about organic no-till, but I don't know if you can speak to that at all and maybe combine that with some of the other things you saw in your study.
Yeah, I would just say that that comment is exactly right. I mean, we know that crop diversity is really important. It's important to incorporate the different cover crops that you might be growing. It's important to rotate your different cash crops. But again, because the in organic systems, weed control is such a tough issue. Farmers have to rely on tillage. That's just the reality of it. And I know that there's some research on organic no-till, but that is really challenging in terms of weed control. So I don't know if it's totally practical for most organic farmers to try to go no-till.
You mentioned a few things that you're planning on working on a little bit more with this data set. Can you talk a little bit more about maybe some other areas and questions you have in store?
Yeah, so if you notice, we really focused on kind of the soil biological health indicators. And I think a really important piece of this is thinking about the soil physical health, especially because tillage seemed to be such an important component. So we're actually right now running aggregate stability on all of these samples. And so hopefully we'll be able to report back on a different, in a different talk, and wanting to be able to pull out, which management practices were most important in terms of increasing the physical health of the soil as well. And I think another really kind of important component is this trade-off between crop diversity and tillage and the inclusion of perennials. So we do quite a bit of work on different perennial grains, incorporating, alfalfa and rotations, and how that increases soil health over time. And so I have grad students right now that are looking at nematode communities and seeing how the incorporation of alfalfa benefits nematodes, which we think are an important indicator of the soil food web, and then linking that to other soil health indicators that reflect soil organic matter cycling. I see Steve Coleman has a raised hand.
Yeah, Christine, thanks. I just kind of curious, these results were surprising to me too, because I guess I feel like a lot of the literature and just some of just a whole collective experience of studies that we've seen. And even if we look at our long-term tillage plots in Ohio, we can see that, surprisingly, depending on the rotation, if we have what we found anyways, there's like more diverse rotations, even with a plow treatment, can still, from a soil health perspective, some of these same measurements not be nearly as, we think moldboard plowing, like this is an annual moldboard plow event for 50 straight years, or 50, almost 60 straight years.
Yeah.
But when we have more diversity in that rotation, then it's it's not as detrimental as you might think it would be. And so anyways, my kind of general sense, or my bias, is that tillage doesn't really isn't as big of a deal as we might think it is. If we have roots in there, then the roots are actively doing their thing and fostering life and kind of promoting soil health in general. And so it's just like, I guess, a comment that it was a bit surprising to me. And I'm just curious about the growers on the call, if there's, just comments in terms of if you feel like tillage practices are a major problem on your farm, or if you feel like having a diversity of crops helps take some of those effects away, or just any overall comments just in terms of these findings. Because if I had to guess before I looked or saw any of your data, I would have thought that the tillage would not have had a large of an impact. But clearly we can't argue with the results that you've got. They're robust, and they're across a couple hundred different farms. So just wondering if anybody else has thoughts about this relationship between tillage and crop diversity, and any observations that you've seen.
I would be glad to make a comment unless somebody else wants to. I don't want to be always the one talking.
Please, Eli, go ahead.
Okay, well, I will then. I think on our farm, we would like to minimize tillage, both because it's a lot of work, but also because we do see some negative effects of that, mainly in the research, not on our farm itself. So we would like to minimize our tillage if we can, but from what I've seen, the bigger impact is compaction. The compaction shows up so readily apparent. We have manure tankers that, when they turn in a particular spot, or even if they drive at an angle, it is so obvious that I think that is an area that we can make a lot of improvement very quickly in our soil health, as opposed to minimizing the tillage that we are already working to minimize. And I don't think we will see as big of a benefit there, if that makes sense.
So a lot of impact in terms of the compaction, and appreciate those comments. Interesting.
Yeah, I think that's super helpful to hear, and that's why I'm so looking forward to looking at the aggregate stability kind of piece of this project, because I think that will kind of shed light on a totally different soil health process that we haven't really touched on in this set of data. And Steve, just one other point that I'll make is, I think we have to be careful how we compare tillage done on farmer fields versus long-term trials. Like, how many passes is the mobile board plow actually going through on our no-till trials here at OSU compared to what we're actually seeing on farmer fields? I mean, sometimes we saw 15, 16, 17 plus passes over a course of 4 years, which I know we're not really replicating in our on-station trials.
Yeah, we just do the primary tillage and then a finishing and then it's on to planting. So yeah. And so again, that's a conventional long-term trial where herbicides are used, of course, for weed control. And a lot of times, a lot of the tillage, of course, this kind of stale seed bed just to help exhaust some of that seed weed bank on an organic farm might be a very different scenario. So yeah.
What about the use of manures too? I mean, isn't that that's higher among organic growers than conventional growers? Would that have an effect as well?
Yeah, so let me pull this up, because 87% of farmers were using manures. We weren't really able to pull out a significant difference because most farmers were adding manure. So I think it's an important management practice for improving soil health on your farms. We just weren't able to pull that out because most farmers were doing it.
Quick question, back on the slide that showed the perennial wheatgrass versus the annual grass, or the annual wheat, sorry. When were those both planted? Is that like the first year for that perennial wheatgrass, or?
So for this particular diagram, you can see that this September it's been in the ground for 12 months.
Okay.
And then in the June figure, it's shown for 21 months.
Okay.
But so we'll say, we've done research. Both Steve and I have worked in perennial grain crops and looked at root systems. And what we see is that there's always greater reproduction throughout kind of the phase of the perennial crop when you relate it to an annual system, but it does increase over time.
Okay, thanks. Another question from Larry Phelan. Have you statistically tried to separate the effects of tillage and crop diversity using like multiple regression, structural equation modeling, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, we have. And so I didn't want to bring that in because it gets more complicated, but we do see that, especially for respiration, tillage is the main factor that seems to have an impact on respiration. But for things like active carbon and protein, we actually do see that crop diversity on its own has the biggest influence. And so again, those more advanced statistical tools do shed light on how these specific management practices do impact the specific soil health indicators differently. So that's a good question.
Fascinating. I think oh wait, no, there's a few more here. Okay, based on Eli's comments, would you expect, that was on compaction, I think, would you expect fields with controlled RTK traffic to be different in soil health compared to random traffic field samples?
I mean, I would definitely think that the more traffic that you have, you're going to have a greater reduction in soil health. It is kind of hard to track that with these, I would say, soil biological health indicators. But again, that aggregate stability piece where we're going to try to understand the soil physical health, I think we'll be able to get at some of that. That's another good point, is we didn't really ask about like traffic on farmer fields in the management survey. So we can't really get at that specific question. So that's maybe something we should add, but we can do it in terms of the type of tillage and the frequency of tillage.
So I saw you did have some diversity in answers on whether or not cover crops were used. So any findings on that? Or, and did you look at factors like how long they were used, when they were used, those kinds of things?
Yeah, so another really important question. I basically looked at presence and absence, which that actually is not the best way to look at cover crops in this specific scenario, just because when cover crops weren't present, there was like over 90% of the time there was a perennial. So you're kind of comparing soils where there was a perennial versus a cover crop. And I actually would like to go back and do another analysis, just looking at the soils with cover crops, and then thinking, length of time within the rotation, because I think that is an important component. But just like a rough, looking at no cover to cover, we did not really see any differences.
Did you, there's a good comment on the chat about maybe looking at seeding rate on the cover crops as well. So I don't know if you collected that data.
Yeah, we didn't ask about seeding rates, which that's these are all questions that again are really important, and I think kind of highlight the challenge of trying to do a study at this broad scale, where we have working with almost 200 different farms, and it would be much easier to ask these types of questions working, doing on-farm sampling and doing more intensive sampling on a smaller subset of farms. So there are definitely limitations to what we can actually get at with this type of study.
Without making a survey that's 20 pages long.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
We know farmers love to do surveys. We're coming up on the end of our time, but if anyone has a last question or comment, feel free to drop it in the chat or open up your mic. Hearing none. Christine, can you stop sharing your screen?
Yes.
And I will post a recording of this online, and we'll also, Christine, if you would be kind enough to share your slides.
Sure. Yeah.
That would be wonderful. I know we had at least one person who couldn't see the visuals during this. So.
I'll also put my email in the chat if people have questions. Perfect. We're doing several on-farm trials right now where we're working with farmers to understand soil health on their farmer fields. So if people would be interested in working with us or wanting to get these types of soil health indicators on their farm, please reach out to us. We'd be happy to have you as part of our study.
Yes, I would like to see more organic samples keep coming in. Just wanted to share quick that we are having a transition to organic grains. It's kind of an all-day workshop, and that's coming up on March 30th from 9 to 2. So if that's of interest to someone you know, please share it. That's going to be at the Putnam County, but I believe they're also offering online access to this. So if you have someone that doesn't want to travel or is still worried about COVID, those are options as well. So we do not have a seminar next week on the 24th. It unfortunately got canceled, but we will be back on March 31st with a little more on soil health, this time focusing on urban soils and post-industrial management. So using organic methods. So that's going to be pretty interesting. And stop sharing. I guess that's it, unless anyone has another comment or question. So thank you so much for joining us, everyone, and go out and enjoy the sunshine. Thanks, Christine.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.